Will California's skyscrapers be able to withstand a major earthquake? Major earthquakes are 7 magnitude and above. Well, we've recently had major earthquakes in California, and we've seen that, for example, we're coming up to the 25th anniversary of the Northridge, California quake, and that was also in July of 1994, and we saw that infrastructure such as roads and bridges collapsed, and also buildings and skyscrapers, sides of buildings, apartment buildings, did not fare well at all. Now, this is from an investor magazine. The National Real Estate Investor, for example, states that in case of skyscrapers, structural integrity during earthquakes, the real estate investors and developers need to keep that in mind, that California is due for a major quake. We're talking about the big one as well. In an effort to reduce traffic and improve quality of life by creating pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, major West Coast cities are encouraging developers to build higher buildings and avoid pushing the surrounding suburbs further and further outwards. So that's one reason why they're trying to create higher buildings, to create more green areas, for example. In a recent New York Times article, there was a question the viability of continuing to encourage vertical construction, that is, towards the sky, as opposed to horizontal construction, because the buildings would be more vulnerable to earthquakes, particularly San Francisco and Los Angeles. These are the cities, of course, that are major cities, hubs that lie on the San Andreas Fault. They're located on the highest risk Class 4 seismic zones. San Francisco now has 160 buildings taller than 240 feet, and a dozen more are in the planning stage or currently under construction, according to the New York Times. San Francisco has a building height limit of 970 feet in the area, where the new 1,070-foot Salesforce Tower is located, according to Tom Hui. He's the director of the San Francisco Department of Building Inspection, and he is a structural and civil engineer. But the currently tallest building in the city, a joint venture of Boston Properties and Hines that was designed by Clark Pelly, was approved because its seismic performance goes above and beyond what is required, according to what Hui notes. It's located adjacent to downtown San Francisco New Transit Center. Foundation of Salesforce Tower the foundation goes down 200 feet all the way to the bedrock, says Hui, and uses a seismic force-resistant building system composed of specific reinforced concrete shear walls, 24 to 48 inches thick, at the central elevator and stair core, and a structural load-resisting steel column and floor framing support system. Project structural engineer Clemenic Associates led the development and adoption of performance-based seismic design, PBSD for short, an approach that results in buildings that are safer and perform more predictably during earthquakes than structures that rely on a strictly code-based approach. PBSD uses nonlinear computer modeling to meet the intent of the building code and quantifies the building's performance during multiple seismic scenarios. Still, the question for real estate developers may be whether there is an increased risk in buying skyscrapers in California. According to a Caltech civil engineer, research professor based in Pasadena, the state made seismic retrofitting of hospitals and schools mandatory following the Northridge quake of 1994, which was only a 6.7 magnitude, and it did that much damage. But newer, more stringent seismic requirements now also apply to all new buildings. This is what Monica Kohler points out. She says, while the code may be similar for buildings whether they are under or over 75 feet high, William Strawn, manager of legislative public affairs with the San Francisco Department of Building Inspection, stresses that much more goes into evaluating a building's performance during an earthquake than building height. The bottom line, structural requirements are more strict as buildings get, of course, taller. As a result, he says the new skyscrapers are the safest buildings in the city. The new ones, what about the old ones? The new ones being what? After the Northridge quake of 1994, I guess. Straw notes that San Francisco has some of the most stringent seismic requirements in the state and possibly the world. All new projects must meet basic California seismic code and tighter local code amendments, both of which are updated every 3 years, based on what is learned from earthquakes occurring around the world. The latest local amendment, performance base, requires by ABO 82 and ABO 83, which call for a review of projects by a panel consisting of structural and geostructural engineers and an academic professor who used PBSD modeling to predict how the building's design and material will perform during an earthquake, says Hui. Kohler notes that the city of Los Angeles also calls for the use of computer modeling to determine how buildings will perform during an earthquake. But no matter how expert the computer modeling, all earthquakes are different and they continue to surprise us, she adds. A way to monitor a building's actual performance during earthquakes would be to install seismic sensors that measure a building's shaking during a seismic event. She says we're flying blindly without sensors. This is what Kohler says. There may be lots of buildings with fractures prior to earthquakes, but because the building's motion was not recorded, no one knows where to look for these fractures. Yes, it's logical. Even with a 6 or 5.4 or 6.4 earthquake, the building could sustain fractures. And then, with a smaller or equal earthquake, it can crumble apart. That's the truth of it. Now, it also goes with the residences that the scientists and the geologists were warning us about. With all this quaking, a lot of buildings are coming apart. Now, Kohler also notes that modeling does not always take into account how a building's underground infrastructure like parking, garages, utilities, subway stations might perform during an earthquake and how much each system might impact surrounding structures. And Straw agrees and says there is no such thing as an earthquake-proof building because you just don't know where or how an earthquake will strike. Since 2013, San Francisco has required that older wood-framed multifamily buildings with a soft story condition complex complete a mandatory seismic retrofit program. Today, nearly 5,000 of those buildings, represented 90% of that building stock, have completed or are in the final stages of the retrofits. Another 900 or so buildings face a September 15 deadline to comply with these requirements. This article was written last year, by the way. Now, these adjustments are particularly important because California is due for a major earthquake, which happens along the San Andreas Fault about every 150 years, and according to all soil samples examined by researchers, she notes that mandatory retrofitting is the best way to prepare for such an event. After the Northridge earthquake, Los Angeles began identifying at-risk buildings as well as plans to implement a similar retrofit program. Kohler points out that while this is not a terribly large magnitude earthquake, a lot of older buildings collapse because they lack the strength to withstand the side-by-side motion with the quake. Buildings with a soft first story, like an open garage, because the support columns were too slender to bear the building's weight will collapse. Unreinforced concrete, brick and concrete block buildings which don't have the support to move sideways will collapse. And non-ductile concrete buildings with little or no steel reinforcement, which can lead to cracking during seismic events. Now, a study concerning Los Angeles buildings, this is on LA Curbed by Melissa Clifford. LA buildings will shake more in earthquakes than previously predicted. This is a July 9th, 2018 article just last year. Developers and builders will have to reassess the safety of tall buildings. We're talking about skyscrapers. There's a shift happening in earthquake science, and it's not just in the tectonic plates. Results of a few new 5-year study revealed that the way experts model potential earthquakes is changing for good. Experts behind the Cybershake project say they identified a far more accurate and localized method of simulating earthquakes' effects at specific locations. The new models, LA is expected to see 10 to 50% more shaking across all magnitudes of earthquakes than previous models suggested. The results have major implications for Los Angeles skyscrapers and the future of building safety. Tom Jordan, a professor of geological sciences at USC, and he's the lead author of Cybershake, he says, we can't predict earthquakes. We cannot predict earthquakes. But what we're doing is a much better job of predicting what will happen when these earthquakes occur. In the wake of Cybershaking's findings, developers and builders will have to reassess the safety of tall buildings, what experts call buildings of 20 stories or more. They'll also have to figure out how to build stronger structures in the future, according to John Vidal, director of the Southern California Earthquake Center, which ran the study. In the past, LA City had refused calls from experts to make a comprehensive list of earthquake-prone buildings, but in the past few years, the city has amped up efforts to supply engineers with the data they'll need to secure buildings against the ever-impending big one. In 2014, they identified about 14,000 buildings, including apartment buildings, that are at risk of collapsing in a major earthquake. Okay, 14,000 buildings. Scientists at UCLA have also launched a program to expand earthquake-resistant design for individual skyscrapers and earthquake-resilient design for entire communities. Now, city law now requires tall buildings to be outfitted with earthquake data gathering instruments. In the decades before Cybershake, scientists relied on retroactive models called ground motion prediction equations, or GMPEs. These equations are pieced together using historical records of quakes from around the world. Cybershake, launched in response to the data showing that the Los Angeles basin was moving differently than previous calculations predicted, revealed that past methods resulted not only in very broad estimates, but also in largely inaccurate estimates. Instead, it relies on local conditions and existing geology. Now, Vidal says we're making a shift from thinking about how dangerous the quakes are by looking at past records to calculating what the next one will look like based on geology. And instead of going on the track record, we're looking at the physics of where we are and what's coming next. Historically, GMPEs were used as the basis for building code design, but now with Cybershake technology, its authors say engineers can couple predictive seismograms with structural simulations to better design the buildings. And that's especially important civic facilities such as hospitals, dams, power plants, I would say churches and schools as well. they have to have very strong earthquake-resistant buildings. It's also possible that using cybershake technology, engineers will be able to locate a building plan tailored for seismic hazards specific to a proposed site. The new models also show that some geographical regions are more dangerous than previously thought. Those are in the large basins like Los Angeles and Mexico City are particularly at risk because the ground there is very soft and deep, so much so that experts often equate the shaking to be jiggling of a bowl of jelly. Can you imagine? That's just terrible. New York Times says in some areas of Los Angeles County like Century City, Culver City, Long Beach, or Santa Monica, the new projections may nearly double the previous estimates for the type of ground shaking that's almost threatening to a tall building. But experts are quick to remind us that estimates are not good guarantees. It doesn't mean that the ground motion will go super high at all the locations. It may increase the risk effectively, but we don't know by which amount. That might mean there will be more windowless skyscrapers in LA's future. The strength of a building is determined by factors like how much steel is used and how many open spaces and windows it has. Buildings will open with open spaces like atriums and will causeways with open causeways are much more weaker than in the event of an earthquake. So, moving forward, engineers and the city officials will have to grapple with how to implement these new predictions into safer building codes. But because the building codes change every 6 years, there are many buildings in LA right now that are technically up to code, but structurally unsound, according to Golet. Landlords and developers will have to decide whether to reinforce those buildings that were deemed earthquake safe as far as back as the 1930s. Golet says people have to realize that codes evolve over time. As a society, we'll have to make choices. Choices, Golet says, about what era code should be used as the safety standard. Seattle is one of the first cities to have made that choice. It announced that it will start using CyberShake's new maps in determining building codes starting December 1st. But for now, Los Angeles engineers and scientists like Golet are waiting to hear when the new models will be taken into account. Jim Maley, the structural engineer and co-organizer of the conference, told the New York Times, "We have to incorporate it. We have not settled on how." If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.